My name is Kevin Avruch, and I'm the Dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, Schar. Schar was founded in 1980 by a group of Mason faculty who imagined what a curriculum and a degree in conflict analysis and resolution would look like. As social scientists, we understood the dynamic states of social conflict and that many disciplines and many methodologies were needed to study its causes and to investigate the possibilities for resolution. In 1981, the first cohort of master's students and all those who followed began exploring this question with us, with faculty and students who are dedicated to the most rigorous scholarship and research into the root causes of destructive conflict. We are committed to education and engagement through practice. We bring our research into the world and strive to create ethical solutions. In 1982, we were the only postgraduate program in the world in conflict resolution, and now there are over 100 similar programs in colleges and universities, many of them founded or staffed by our alumni. Today, more than 1,800 Schar alumni, master's, PhD, and since 2004, our talented undergraduates are working internationally and domestically to produce positive change. The legacy of our founding faculty connects each incoming class with new generations of faculty and practitioner thought leaders dedicated to understanding how collective effort, trust, and resilience can address these great challenges. We are here tonight to celebrate Stuart Eizenstat and his recent book, President Carter, The White House Years. As president, Jimmy Carter was the embodiment of American values for human rights, dignity, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. Among his many diplomatic accomplishments were the negotiation of the Panama Canal Treaty, restoring Canal's sovereignty to the nation and people of Panama, and the SALT II nuclear arms reduction treaty with the Soviet Union. Many people, of course, note the Camp David Accords in 1978 as the crowning achievement of his presidency. It set the stage for the 1979 Israel-Egypt peace treaty, which has endured, and we honored the 40th anniversary of the Accords earlier this year. After leaving the nation's highest office, Jimmy Carter devoted his life to peace building. Through the Carter Center, Jimmy and Rosalind, and they are very much a pair, Jimmy and Rosalind served and advanced the causes of human rights, democracy, gender equality, initiatives in global health. Jimmy Carter continued working as a citizen diplomat and mediator in many places to diffuse international conflicts. And in 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of a lifetime commitment. In late December of 2016, we were proud to learn that President and Mrs. Carter agreed to our request to launch a fundraising campaign to name George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution in honor of the Carters. Adding the Carter name to Schar would create a tribute to our shared values while moving us forward to imagine, that word again, to imagine what else we can accomplish and how, collectively, to bring positive change to the world. Now I am delighted to introduce our special guest, the 72nd Governor of Virginia and distinguished visiting professor with the Schar School of Policy and Government, Terry McAuliffe. Governor McAuliffe entered national politics, in fact, as the National Finance Director for Jimmy Carter. There's a tale there, which you might tell. He co-chaired Bill Clinton's 1996 campaign for re-election and Clinton's 1997 presidential inauguration. Governor McAuliffe was chairman of the Democratic National Convention from 2000 to 2005, and he was also chairman of Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. As governor of Virginia, he oversaw a drop in unemployment from 5.4% to 3.6%, a 44-year low in unemployment claims, and a 12.3% rise in personal incomes. He protected women's access to health care, he bolstered the public school system, and he restored voting rights to 173,000 rehabilitated felons. Please join me in welcoming Governor Terry McAuliffe.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Come on, this is an exciting night. Thank you, Dean, for having me here today. It is great to be back. As I've had a lot of titles. I was a governor. I had a rank of ambassador for a while. I was a chairman of the National Party, but nothing like a distinguished professor at the Schar School. That is, right, Mark? We have the dean with us here today, but I love George Mason. As governor, I'm proud that I put the largest investment of any governor into George Mason University, because there is not a university in our entire system in Virginia that serves more minority at-need students than George Mason University does. And I'm very proud of all the great work that they do and the great accomplishments that they have had. I wanted to be here tonight. I've been doing Canvas kickoffs all afternoon. I'm going back to do a couple more. I won't make today political, but record crowds seem to be showing up this year for some reason. There we go. I think I'm at a home game here. But I wanted to come here for Stu. I've known Stu for a very long time. As the dean mentioned, I actually got my start in politics with President Carter right out of college. I left Georgetown Law School, forfeited a scholarship, went to work on the Carter campaign for the re-elect. Best experience of my life. We did not win that election, but I gained a lot of great experience. But Stu is such a gem in this country when you think of all the accomplishments that he has had. And it's appropriate now with George Mason School Conflict Analysis and Resolution that we're talking about Jimmy Carter, because living through those 4 years of things that this man accomplished, and I don't think today everybody quite understands or appreciates the great work that President Carter had done. He ran into some tough issues, obviously some embargoes, we had the Iranian hostages, but this man leaned in every single day, the most honest, hardworking, dedicated person we could have ever had in the White House. And right there with him was Stuart Eizenstat. He started off as his domestic policy advisor, in charge of all domestic policy. Actually went on to be very successful. His partner, his deputy, was actually David Rubenstein, who went on to found the Carlyle Group. These guys have done very well. But Stu has stayed active, involved in so many different areas. He served in many capacities in the Clinton administration as Secretary of Commerce as well as in state. He was instrumental in the framework for our dealings with the European Union. So I can't wait to hear Stu's comments on his thoughts on what's happened to our relationships with the European Union. But a lot of the things that we do today were the framework that actually Stu had actually put together as ambassador to the European Union. But he led on so many different avenues on litigation, commercial litigation. He's at Covington and Burley now, heads up all of their international practice. But one thing I was very proud that Stu did, long overdue in the Clinton administration, really took the lead for our country to go after all of what the Nazis had taken from the Jewish communities throughout the world. He led that effort to make sure people got their insurance policies back, to make sure that what had been stolen, had been looted, had been returned to their rightful owner. And Stu, talk about complex negotiations and litigation, but Stuart did all of that and was highly successful at that. But he has been at the forefront of American politics and American policy for a very long time. And I'm just honored to be here tonight to introduce him. I can't wait to read his book. I've been part of the Carter administration. But these two individuals, Jimmy Carter and Stuart Eizenstat, we are a better world today. And the world thinks better of the United States of America because of the work that these two individuals did. So, you know, I'm honored now to bring to the podium Stuart Eizenstat.
Thank you, Governor. It's very meaningful to be introduced by you. I've had a great respect and affection for you, and throughout your career, you were a great governor of this state. And I want to say right here, your future is not over by any means. I just want to recognize a few people. First, Dean Avruch, what you've created here is really unique. This is the first ever School of Conflict Resolution and Analysis in the United States. And it's a vision that you've had. We're hopeful that ultimately it will be named for President and Mrs. Carter. But you've really laid an immense foundation that policymakers can use for generations to come, and you're to be congratulated for that. I also, if I may, want to just mention on a personal note, Carol Saunders. Carol is the widow of one of the heroes in my book, Hal Saunders, who was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. He was instrumental in one of the great accomplishments of this administration, which was Camp David and the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. He was involved in the Iranian negotiations as well. And I know you miss him every day, but the nation does as well, Carol. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention some very dear friends who have come in from further out in Virginia, Claudia and Bill Stiebel. Thank you very much for coming. And want to thank Maria for all the work she's done on this project. Jimmy Carter's political hero was Harry Truman, and he brought Harry Truman's famous slogan, "The buck stops here," on his Oval Office desk. Both presidents left office highly unpopular. Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements than for his failures. And I hope that my book will have a similar reassessment of Jimmy Carter as president, not just an as admired former president. He honored the office. He respected the independence of the Justice Department, the FBI, the role of the press, even when it was brutal toward him. 2 independent surveys indicate that almost 70% of all of our legislation was passed by Congress, just under the percentage of the legendary Lyndon Johnson, who was actually my first boss in the White House. Walter Mondale, his vice president, put it very succinctly: we told the truth, we obeyed the law, and we kept the peace. Now, the rap on the Carter presidency is signified by what I call 4 I's: inflation, Iran, inexperience by the president and his so-called Georgia mafia, and Terry, inter-party warfare with Ted Kennedy and the liberal wing of the party, which divided us going into the 1980 election. And I don't shy from discussing these at all. One of the reasons that the book has been very well reviewed by the New York Times and Post and others is because I'm candid about these. I do not whitewash them at all, nor others, since this is a school of conflict resolution. I also discuss at great length the real split in foreign policy between Cy Vance, who was dovish toward the Soviet Union, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, our national security advisor, who was a hawk. And in fact, during the transition, when we beat President Ford, I was the only aide that President Carter had for the CIA briefings. And during one of the breaks, he said, "Stu, you've worked with both of them during the campaign as my policy director. I'm thinking of appointing Cy as Secretary of State and Zbig as National Security Advisor. What do you think?" I said either one would be great, but together they would be a combustible mixture. They have a diametrically opposite view of the major challenge you're going to face with the Soviet Union. And he said, "I can handle it. I like differences of opinion." In fact, it created a real dissidence that was not really remedied until the Afghan invasion. More on that shortly. But the point is, there are real problems, but they have obscured the enormous accomplishments at home and abroad. And I wanted to write this book to give a complete reassessment of the presidency. Yes, the mistakes and failures, including my own. This is not a book that could be known if he had only listened to me. But also the achievements, which again have been obscured by this. And I wanted to do it while there were still living eyewitnesses, including, by the way, the president, and before history's verdict was indelibly sealed that this was somehow a failed presidency. The authenticity of the book is based heavily on 5,000 contemporaneous pages of notes that I took. I've been an inveterate note taker since my college days at University of North Carolina and my Harvard Law School days, and I brought that into the White House. Every meeting, every phone call, every interaction I had, I recorded verbatim, and I augmented that with over 350 interviews, 5 with the president himself, and I wasn't selective. I chose detractors and supporters, Republicans and Democrats, to provide a complete picture of the presidency. Now let me take you back, and looking at the age of some of the students, you weren't even born at the time, so let me take you back to the 1970s when we governed, because it's important to understand the era in which we were governing, to appreciate the challenges, the failures, and successes. The 1970s was a decade of epic change in which the post-World War II consensus that Hal Saunders was part of began to break down. It broke down because of our first military defeat in Vietnam, because of urban violence, and because of an economic phenomenon that economists had to give a new name for: stagflation, simultaneous slow growth and high inflation, which bedeviled all 3 presidents who governed in the 1970s, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. It was also a decade in which a whole set of new movements began, which are still very much with us today, but were very new at the time. The environmental movement, the consumer movement, the Black Power movement, now morphed into, the whole Black Lives Matter. The women's rights movement, now #MeToo. And yes, the pro-life movement, right after Roe v. Wade was decided in the Supreme Court and abortion became a huge issue. It also inaugurated a new political movement that is extraordinarily important today in 2018. And that is the Evangelical Christian movement that Reverend Falwell politicized and made a major political force. He, Falwell, called Carter, who was perhaps the most religious president we've ever had, not a real Baptist, and accused him of harboring homosexuals on his staff. And Ronald Reagan in 1980 very skillfully took that new, energized evangelical movement, largely based in the South, and married it to Richard Nixon's so-called silent majority of disaffected white working class workers in the North. That's precisely the coalition that got Reagan into office, and it's the base of our current president's coalition as well. Abroad, the 1970s were also a time of major import. The Soviet Union was at the apex of its power and influence. Huge military buildups on land, sea, and air, threatening our own superiority, supporting Cuban proxy troops in fomenting communist revolutions in the Horn of Africa, Angola, Namibia, supporting Euro-communist parties with particular success in Italy. They were at their most aggressive, as we learned during the administration, and more on that in a minute, in Afghanistan. It was also a decade in which a new power began to inch toward the world stage, China. Again, more on that shortly. It was a decade in which a Polish-born priest became Pope John Paul II and gave hope to those behind the Iron Curtain and in the Soviet Union, along with Carter, energizing a new democratic movement, a new movement based on human rights. And yes, it was a decade of a revolution that totally engulfed us and with which we deal every single day. There's hardly a day it's not in a newspaper, and oftentimes in the front page, and that is the radical Islamic revolution in Iran that, again, I'll discuss in a moment. His domestic achievements are so unrecognized, and I think they begin with energy security. The energy security we enjoy today as a nation, the lack of dependence on OPEC oil that all presidents in the 1970s had to suffer through, including Nixon with the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC embargo, owes largely to the foundation that we laid with three major energy bills. And those energy bills deregulated in controls on natural gas and crude oil, which had been there for years, to stimulate domestic production, and we will be, in 2020, the major producer of energy in the world, more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia. Carter put energy conservation at the center of his energy policy with the first fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, insulation standards and the like, and he inaugurated the new era of clean energy, geothermal, wind, and in particular solar energy. And symbolically, I was with him when he installed the first solar panel on the roof of the White House to indicate that this is our future. And by the way, now 10% of all of our new electricity comes from solar power. And appropriately, and for those of you who are students in conflict resolution, he did it with something that would not be imaginable today. The toughest energy battle we had, it took 18 bloody months, was deregulating natural gas that had been regulated since 1948. And how did he do it? In the map room of the White House, where FDR charted the course of World War II, and we often felt like we were in the midst of a war. But he did it with two conservative Republican senators, Domenici and McClure, two liberal House members, Corman and Rangel, who agreed on a formula that would be unimaginable in today's Washington. But it happened, and he forged that agreement. He was also a great consumer champion, appointing consumer advocates, many from Ralph Nader's organizations, to regulate industries, not taking, as today, those who came from industry or lobbied for industry, to regulate the very industries with which they were associated, and then married that with major legislation that totally transformed our whole domestic transportation era. We deregulated truck, rail, buses, and most important for those of us who are flyers, airlines. The JetBlues, the Southwest Airlines would not have the kind of power they do today in a regulated system where the laws prevented them from coming into the market. We democratized air travel. We brought it to the middle class. It may seem uncomfortable when you're in the middle seat in the economy class, but the fact is we did, and we created price competition. In addition, we began the deregulation of telecommunications and really inaugurated the new cable era. And for those of you who are aficionados of local craft beers, we even ended prohibition era regulations which prevented the flow of local craft beers. He was, I think, the greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt. He stopped costly and environmentally damaging water projects in their tracks and doubled the size of the entire national park system that Theodore Roosevelt created with the Alaska Lands Bill over the fierce opposition of the Alaska delegation, which wanted the whole state available for oil and gas exploration. And he did it in typical sort of Carter detailed fashion. He took a giant map of Alaska, laid it on the Oval Office rug, got on his hands and knees with Senator Ted Stevens, who was the senior Republican senator, and pointed out every mountain stream, every range, what would be in the national park, what would be available for development. And Stevens said to us afterward, he couldn't believe that Carter knew his state better than he did after representing it for 25 years. It's an enormous environmental legacy. In an ethically challenged Washington, we laid the foundation for every single major piece of ethics legislation which exists to this very day. So the ethics law of 1978, for the first time, required the disclosure of all assets and particular conflicts of interest by incoming senior officials. It set very strict gift limits, at that time $25, more on that in a minute. and it limited the ability of officials to lobby the agencies from which they came. The Office of Inspectors General, we have our 40th anniversary coming up with 2 events in this month, to create independent officials in each federal agency to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. Where did Mueller come from? We created the Office of Special Counsel by legislation in a post-Watergate environment. We won the election in '76 against Ford, pledging a government as good as its people, I'll never lie to you, and we put that into action. We also had merit selection panels for federal judges. We reformed the civil service system. We created an act called the FCPA, which prohibited U.S. companies from paying bribes to get foreign business. All of this and much more. 2 anecdotes. I got caught up in the gift limit. Early in the administration, there was a profile done of me in a business magazine saying, not totally accurately, that I had a great love for the little 1-cent Tootsie Rolls that we had as kids. And so the Tootsie Roll company sent me an enormous box of Tootsie Rolls that would have lasted for a lifetime. And I had kids then who were 3 and 6, and I thought I was going to be father for life, only to find out from the White House counsel, he said, damned if I'm going to count every one of these, but they probably are worth more than $25. You got to return it. So I sent a letter to the CEO and explained, we were in a new post-Watergate era and higher moral standards. About a year later, there's a profile done of the Tootsie Roll Company, and the CEO says, Eizenstat tried to have it both ways. He sends high and mighty, new moral standards. We open the box, it's empty. So I'm still trying to find a Secret Service agent who stole my Tootsie Rolls. More significant, more serious, and more relevant is the special counsel. Ironically, the first target of the special counsel office that we created was none other than the president's own chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, who was falsely accused by a fellow named Roy Cohn, who was the hatchet man for Senator McCarthy and the first political mentor for Donald J. Trump, and who represented the owners of Studio 54 in New York and contended that Ham, who was in the bar, and he shouldn't have been, had snorted cocaine. Totally false, $1 million legal fees later, grand jury 24-0 says nothing, but that's not the point. The point is that this investigation went on in a re-election year of his own chief of staff on totally phony charges. Not once did Carter call it a witch hunt, try to intervene, try to undermine it, because he believed in the rule of law and let it take its course. It's a very important lesson, and I'll let you make the comparisons yourself. Here's also a Southern president from the deepest part of the Deep South who appoints more women and more African Americans, blacks as we called them then, to senior positions and to judgeships than all 38 presidents before him put together. If anybody has seen the documentary RPG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or even if you haven't, she's quoted in my book as saying, I would never have been on the Supreme Court had Carter not appointed me to the Court of Appeals and opened up the judiciary to women. We supported affirmative action, now under attack, and I say now, saved New York City and Chrysler from bankruptcy, but importantly, he was also an education president. And here we are, George Mason. He created the Department of Education. We doubled the size of Head Start. We made major changes to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, opening it up to more minority students and more low-income students. The Higher Education Amendments in 1978 and 1980 tripled the number of young people who could qualify for Pell Grants. In fact, by the time we left office, a third of undergraduates could qualify. He believed deeply that education was an investment. He and Mondale also created the modern vice presidency out of a constitutional afterthought. a position of derision. FDR's first vice president, John Nance Garner, said it wasn't worth a bucket of spit. And when Eisenhower was asked, as Nixon was starting his first election campaign, tell me what your vice president has done, he said, give me a week and I'll try to come up with something. Well, we made it a real office. When we won the election in '76, Mondale sent Carter a memo with 10 requests to try to become a full partner, access to all classified documents, the ability to come into any meeting unannounced, one-on-one meetings between just the two of them in the Oval Office every week at lunch. Carter checked every one and did every one and then added one that hadn't been asked for, which is moving the vice president's office from what was then the executive office building across the alleyway from the West Wing, right into the West Wing, down the hall from the president. And anybody knows anything about either real estate or politics knows that location is everything. And that was symbolic of making the vice presidency a real office and a real partner as it is today. Now, our Achilles heel domestically was also, ironically, Carter's finest hour. It was inflation, one of the I's that I mentioned at the beginning. We inherited high inflation from Nixon and Ford, and it got worse in our administration for a variety of reasons, including the Iranian shutoff of oil, but it got worse. So here we are, July of 1979, we're starting to think about a re-election campaign. And Carter calls us in and he says, I have tried everything to curb inflation. I've had 2 anti-inflation czars. I've given 5 nationwide speeches on inflation. I've created voluntary wage and price guidelines with sanctions on any company that does business with the government unless they abide by those. I've cut domestic spending to try to balance the budget and alienated the liberal wing in the process. Nothing's worked. And he said to us very clearly, if it means my reelection, and it did, I'm not going to let my legacy be permanent high inflation for the country. I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve, knowing in advance, and I mentioned in a celebrated meeting in the Oval Office in the book, Volcker told him exactly what he was going to do. And he said to him, Mr. President, if you appoint me, I know you're going to a reelection campaign. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tighten the money supply. Interest rates are going to go up. Unemployment's going to go up. And I'm going to squeeze inflation out of the system the hard way. And Carter appointed him. And during the 1980 election, not once, and Volcker applauds him for this, not once did Carter ever criticize the double-digit interest rates which Volcker imposed, knowing that was the cost of dealing with this decade-long inflation. And it worked, but not in time for our reelection. Inflation dropped like a rock in 1981-82 for Reagan, and it's been low ever since because the Federal Reserve has continued the Volcker policy. And it's emblematic in many ways of the Carter presidency, of things we planted which blossomed only after we left office. Abroad, his accomplishments were equally dramatic. As the dean said, September 17th, just less than a month ago, was the 40th anniversary of the Camp David Accords. It is, in my opinion, and Hal Saunders was a vital part of this, the greatest diplomatic personal achievement of any president of the United States ever, more than Woodrow Wilson with the Paris Agreement in World War I. Carter poured over intelligence records on Prime Minister Begin of Israel and Anwar Sadat of Egypt to understand their character, to understand their red lines, what could they not go beyond, how far could they be pushed. And then through 13 agonizing days and nights at the presidential retreat in the Catoctin Mountains at Camp David, he personally drafted over 20 separate peace agreements and negotiated separately with Begin and Sadat and their teams because they were like 2 scorpions in the bottle. They so distrusted each other. The first night of those 13 days, we put them together, it was a catastrophe. Never again. And had they been together, it would have ended a lot earlier. And Carter added 2 personal touches. The first Sunday of the 13 days, he took Begin and Sadat in his presidential limousine, and he said, no negotiations, we're not negotiating. I want you to see the Gettysburg battlefield. And he took them on a tour of the battlefield to underscore what 5 wars between Egypt and Israel had meant and lost lives since 1948, when Israel was created. And it had an amazing effect. I mean, Sadat was a military man, a general, and he began to expound on the mistakes that Pickett made in Pickett's last charge for the Confederacy. Begin was anything but a military man, but he extemporaneously, on the battlefield, read and enunciated Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Very, very emotional. Okay, so we come to the last Sunday, the 13th day. We're close, but we still don't have an agreement. And Begin says to Carter, Mr. President, I'm out of here. I cannot make any more concessions. It's not a bluff. I've got an El Al plane waiting at Andrews Air Force Base. Get a White House car and take me out of here. He called it a glorified concentration camp. I cannot go any further. Carter, realizing this would totally undermine Anwar Sadat's historic trip to Israel, in which he declared no more wars. It would inflame the Middle East and further radicalize it, could cost Sadat his life and Carter his presidency, came up with another personal touch. Knowing Begin's love for his 8 grandchildren, he got each of their names, and he had 8 photographs made, copies of himself, Begin, and Sadat at Camp David, personally inscribed each of the names of the grandchildren, walked over to Begin's cabin, hand-delivered it to Begin, and watched as he went through and vocalized the names of each of the grandchildren with blessings for peace by the president. Carter saw Begin's lips quiver, his eyes tear, and he put his bags down and he said, Mr. President, I'll make one last try. The rest is history. 40 years later, never one violation of that agreement. It's central to Israel's security and to our national interests in the region as well. A second innovation in foreign policy, and one very much, Dean, that you referred to, and the essence and the sense of this conflict resolution school, was placing human rights at the center of foreign policy, a real break from the sort of realpolitik of Nixon and Kissinger. This was not a sort of dewy-eyed notion. We were in a contest with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the Third World, and Carter saw this as the foreign policy side of civil rights at home. That our foreign policy, wherever possible, and it was certainly not always possible, should reflect the best American values of tolerance, democracy, promotion of free speech, and being willing to speak to countries who didn't come up to those standards. We applied it in a very controversial way to the pro-American, anti-communist military dictators in Latin America, got thousands of political prisoners released, energized the emerging democratic movements, which then flowered in the 1980s and continue to this day. And we married it and joined it to what was the single most difficult battle we had in the Senate, and we had a lot of them, and that is the Panama Canal Treaty. The American people, 80% initially were against transferring it. It was our canal. What were we doing giving it to the Panamanians, not understanding the history of the canal? And there were 2 political heroes in this. The first, again, something you would not unfortunately see today, was a senator who was very small in physical stature, but a giant of a statesman, Howard Baker, the Republican leader in the Senate, knowing that it would probably foreclose him ever getting the Republican nomination, supported that treaty because he thought it was the right thing to do. Again, can you imagine that happening in today's polarized Washington? And the most costless and perhaps surprising vote came from a very conservative senator from California. In those days, there were conservative senators from California, named Hayakawa. And Hayakawa had coined the phrase, "It's our canal, we stole it fair and square." An unlikely vote for a two-thirds majority. Vice President Mondale knew him from his Senate days and thought that in an institution known for a high vanity level, that Hayakawa's was perhaps way at the top, and he put Hayakawa on the phone with the president, who was in the Oval Office, and the president said, "Senator, what can I do to convince you to support the treaty? Don't talk about the treaty. What I want is I want to share my wisdom with you by meeting you one-on-one alone, to share all of my wisdom with you in the Oval Office every 2 weeks." And Carter said, "Only every 2 weeks? I wouldn't want to limit you to that." Flattered he voted for the treaty. Carter never saw him again. We also applied human rights to the Soviet Union, to what I call their soft underbelly, their dictatorial system. We reached out to the democratic movement headed by Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, to Natan Sharansky, who was the head, and Anatoly Sharansky of the so-called Soviet Jewish Refusnik movement. We doubled Soviet Jewish immigration during our 4 years, and Sharansky in his own memoirs said, "Carter saved my life by declaring in the midst of my trial on the fake charge of being a U.S. spy," that Carter said expressly he was not. And we then combined that soft power of human rights with hard power. Carter is viewed as being weak on defense, and Reagan as being the champion of defense. Now, I give Reagan every credit in the book for building up our military. Every single weapon system that Reagan implemented, all the increases in defense spending Carter began. The MX mobile missile, the stealth bomber, you can see it out at Dulles at the Air and Space Museum. Intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe, which was highly controversial, the cruise missile. All of these were green-lighted by Carter. We reversed the post-Vietnam decline in defense spending. And even conservatives say that Carter's finest hour in defense and foreign policy came when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. One thing you'll see in the book, you'll understand what it is like to work in the hothouse atmosphere of the White House. There's never a day off. So Christmas 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. They depose the leader and put their own puppet leader in. And Carter takes decisive action. We now increase defense spending 5%. It was 3% before. We apply the so-called Carter Doctrine. We say to the Soviets, any further penetration in the Persian Gulf will be met with our military force. We embargoed grain 4 weeks before the Iowa caucuses. Think that was politically tough? We boycotted the Moscow Olympics, remembering the 1936 Berlin Olympics when Hitler was in power and the U.S. went and never complained. And you want to talk about a tough meeting? Carter had all the young Olympians in the White House who had struggled and trained for 4 years to go to Moscow and had to tell them that for national security reasons we were boycotting the Olympics. We ended up creating freedom games, but it wasn't the same. We armed the opposition, the so-called Mujahideen, which some think morphed into the Taliban. These were really tough, difficult responses to the Soviet Union, and it worked. China. Nixon and Kissinger deserve all the credit for reaching out to China, the Shanghai Declaration, but they never established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic because the Taiwan lobby was a major force in the Republican Party, and Nixon didn't want to take them on. We did, and in the Taiwan Relations Act, we severed diplomatic relations with them and made diplomatic relations with the People's Republic, We established a new relation with Taiwan, which exists to this day, both cultural and defense. And then in a really interesting scene in the cabinet room, in the first state visit by a Chinese leader since the end of World War II, little Deng Xiaoping, all 4'11" of them, comes into the cabinet room. And I remember saying to myself, how does this little guy control 1 billion Chinese? And as we're in the cabinet room, he thanks the president for restoring diplomatic relations. And then he takes a small White House notepad and pencil and pushes it over to the president. And he said, now what I really want, shades of today, is I want the lowest U.S. tariff levels on Chinese products so we can do more business with you. And he said, I know that there's a law, it's the Jackson-Vanik law, that prohibits giving countries that kind of tariff benefit if they restrict immigration, as the Soviets did. And he said, this was aimed at the Soviet Union, not at us. We do not restrict immigration. And so with that little pencil and piece of paper, he says to Carter, write on this piece of paper the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year. 1 million? 10 million? So Carter says, I'll tell you what, I'll take 10 million Chinese each year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. Neither had to fulfill that pledge. But it did bring China into the family of nations. Now, the coup de grace to the Carter presidency was Iran. And I am extremely candid, even brutal, in an analysis of what went wrong. I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the Iranian Revolution itself, for the exile of our principal ally, the Shah of Iran, any more than it would be fair to blame Dwight Eisenhower in 1959 for the Castro Revolution 90 miles from our shore, or Barack Obama for Mubarak being deposed in the so-called Arab Spring. But having said that, I believe that during our 4 years, this was the single worst intelligence failure in American history, perhaps rivaled only by the absence of weapons of mass destruction in Iran. Why do I say that? Because the CIA, for our principal ally, and let's remember, they put him back on the throne as a 21-year-old in 1953, working with the British MI6, and deposed a popularly elected prime minister, put the Shah back on the so-called throne, the throne that his father had, the Peacock throne. And then 6 presidents give the Shah our most sophisticated weapons, F-15 planes and the like. And yet they didn't realize that his domestic support rested on quicksand. He had alienated the entire breadth of the population, not just the fundamentalists, the merchant class, the academics, and so forth. They didn't realize, can you imagine this, that for 5 years, our principal ally was getting secret cancer treatments for an incurable form of cancer. They didn't appreciate the impact that Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the radical revolution in exile in Paris, the impact of his cassettes back to Iran were having in fomenting this revolution. Absolutely inexcusable intelligence failures. And then Carter has a major choice to make. The hostages are now taken against every norm of international law. They're kept there for 444 humiliating days. What do you do? This is one case where I wish perhaps he might have listened to me. Both Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, and I recommended immediate military action, not bombing Tehran, but taking a page, and I even use this as an example, out of Jack Kennedy's blockade of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 60% of all of Iran's oil came out of harbors in a place called Karg Island. And Zbig and I recommended blockading or mining those harbors to choke the Iranian economy. I believe it would have worked. Carter was afraid that they would kill the hostages, and he said in a meeting with the hostage families just after they were taken, my number one goal is to get your loved ones back safe and sound, and he did. but at great political cost to himself and reputational cost to the United States. And then compounded what I think was another mistake, with another mistake, and that is he holed himself up in the White House. He canceled campaigning against Kennedy in the primaries. He canceled foreign trips to show that he was working full-time on getting the hostages released. Well, this ended up transferring, we talk about conflict resolution, this transferred more levers of power to Khomeini. He was holding the president hostage in the White House, in effect. And it caused more press attention. Many of you are too young to remember, but Ted Koppel's Nightline program started because of the hostage crisis. And Walter Cronkite, who was then the dean of news reporting, ended every news broadcast, day 105 of the hostage crisis, day 206, day 307. I mean, it was debilitating in the worst way, every single day, like the drip of water. And then the straw that broke the camel's back was the failed rescue mission, Desert One. The common wisdom, which is wrong, is that this again showed somehow that Carter was weak because he didn't order enough helicopters. Total baloney. The military wanted 6, and Carter added 2 more as backups, 8. You couldn't have any more because they had to fit under the carrier so the Soviet reconnaissance couldn't see them. The real problem was there were 4 military services that had to involve themselves in an unbelievably complicated mission to go from Desert One to Tehran and then into the embassy, 3 moves, with 4 military services that never practiced together. There was no joint command at that time. We created it. It's what allowed Barack Obama to take out Osama bin Laden. There was no joint command. And so when the rotor blade of one of those helicopters hit the C-130 cargo plane filled with fuel to refuel the helicopters for their next step, it engulfed 8 brave American servicemen in flames and killed them. And those flames also engulfed the administration as well. My book is not just about policy, it's about people. And the profiles in the book could come out of a Shakespearean play. The heroic and the tragic, the humorous and the villainous. Time obviously here doesn't permit talking about any in detail, but I'll just mention 1 or 2 before I get to Carter and then conclude. If you want to know a lot about Jimmy Carter, you have to know something about Miss Lily and his mother. Here she is as a young registered nurse in Plains, Georgia in the 1940s and early 50s, tending to black and white patients, unheard of, getting paid in chickens and vegetables. At age 68, she goes into the Peace Corps in India, and she was a fierce defender, of course, of her son's presidential campaign. Again, the slogan was, "I'll never lie to you." And a reporter comes down from New York to interview her in Plains and starts throwing tough questions at her. Now, Miss Lillian, you know as her mother, your son must have lied. Come on. And Miss Lillian said, "You're right. He told white lies all the time." "What do you mean by a white lie?" Miss Lillian says, "Well, you know when I said how wonderful it was to have you here in Plains for New York, that was a white lie." She was an amazing person. Rosalind Carter came from being a campaign wife who was so shy she literally couldn't talk on the platform, and blossomed into a remarkable first lady. Sat in on cabinet meetings, was only the 2nd first lady next to Eleanor Roosevelt to testify in Congress, drafted with her staff and passed a major mental health bill. She was a terrific politician and a terrific aide to the president, and it was like seeing a flower just blossom to see her as an effective first lady. Now, Carter himself, of course, is the major character in the book. Here is someone who comes from a gnat-infested hamlet of 500 people to the Oval Office. By indefatigable campaigning, 100 days in Iowa, 100 bloody days in Iowa, when nobody knew who he was, staying with people he couldn't afford a hotel room, staying with any supporters he could have. But it wasn't just indefatigable campaigning. To win the presidency, and it'll be as true in 2020 as it was then, the winner has to understand the pulse of the public at that time. And even in the Democratic primary, when we were running against well-established senators and congressmen, the Democratic voters did not want, nor the general electorate, a revival of the Great Society. That's not what they were looking for, even after 8 Republican years. They wanted trust and honesty and integrity in a post-Watergate era restored. And that's what Carter offered them. He created a coalition that was in a way inherently unstable. White Southerners who were proud to have one of their own in the White House for the first time since Reconstruction, African Americans, working class people in the North, liberal academics. It might have stayed together in better economic times, but it collapsed and fell apart under the Kennedy challenge in bad economic times. He was in many ways the first New Democrat. And may I say, I think Governor McAuliffe, President Clinton, followed in that path, were better politicians than Carter. I'll get to that in a minute. He was fiscally moderate. Jody Powell said he was tight as a tick when it came to spending. He was socially liberal on civil rights, on women's rights, on empowerment of the disadvantaged. He was a liberal internationalist who believed in alliances, believed we couldn't go it alone. He was a free trader, God forbid. And yes, he paid excessive attention to detail, without question. We used to get memos back with misspellings and punctuation marks missing. And he always wanted another appendix to go with the decision memo. And I used to think that was a terrific disadvantage, but I'm not sure it's a bad way to make presidential decisions when you see the way they're made today. He had a very odd view of politics. He was so morally imbued with doing the right thing that compromise was very difficult. And when he did compromise, it always looked like a defeat rather than a victory. He was a ferocious campaigner, and yet he parked politics at the Oval Office door to do what he thought was the right thing, regardless of the political consequences. That was a great strength and a great weakness. It was a great strength because it allowed him to take on politically unpopular things like the Panama Canal Treaty, like the Middle East peace process, like energy policy, which are all political losers. But it was a weakness because he forgot that a president is not just commander-in-chief, he has to be politician-in-chief. He has to nurture his base. He has to keep his party behind him. And we were not able to do that. I think it would have taken a magician to do it. Bill Clinton certainly was able to do it in better times, but we could not. Carter, in the end, was too liberal for the conservatives and too conservative for the liberals, and he paid the price for it. Now, my book really goes in depth into what it's like to be in the White House. You will be a fly on the wall. You'll understand not just the Carter presidency, but what it's like to have tremendous competing pressures from interest groups who want diametrically opposite things and for which there are often no good options. You'll see what it's like to be in that White House atmosphere. So in my book, I'm not nominating Jimmy Carter for a place on Mount Rushmore. What I am suggesting is he belongs in the foothills, mistakes and all, with other presidents who made major contributions to making our country stronger and our world a better place. And that's the basis of my book. Thank you very much. So we'll have time for questions, and if I may just I profile a number of people in the book. One of the most colorful was Russell Long, who was the very colorful senator from Louisiana and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, through which all of our tax and domestic legislation went. And Russell was, in his own right, quite a character, but his father was the legendary Huey Long. If you've read Warren, the Penn book, All the King's Men, he was the governor of Louisiana in the 1920s. And so Russell told me the following story. He said, when I was a young boy, Papa came home to the governor's mansion just stone cold drunk and opened the door with a very shaky hand and key, collapsed in the foyer of the governor's mansion, and I'm holding on, Russell says, to Mama's apron strings as she looks down sternly for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could occur to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said, Papa, without blinking, said, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks, and I'll now take questions from the floor. So I assure you that the dean has only given me water, but I'll be glad to take questions from the floor.
Thank you. So we have time for questions. So I think the first thing to say is really what Stu ended his talk on. If you want to get a sense of the tremendous conflicts of interest and conflicts of moral perspectives within what one assumes is a united team, that is an administration, a White House, to read the enormous conflicts and negotiations that have to happen within the team, within the White House, and then also deal with all of the competing influences, all of the competing interests outside. I can think of no better book to give you that than Stu's book. And of course, in some ways, this is half the story. And one of the reasons why Carter's excellence as a president, standing up for civil rights, women's rights, would make him and Rosalind, and I want to underline that, they were very, very much a team, would make them perfect folks for Schar to honor. It is also the case, of course, that the second part of his career, I'm leaving out the Navy and all of the service there, the second part of his career as, without a doubt, the finest ex-president that we've ever had. And his commitment to not just peace building, but specific things, to the Atlanta Project, where he turned his energies to try and help his hometown, to Habitat for Humanity, to campaigns against African river blindness, which he and others succeeded in eliminating, essentially. All of those things just multiply to convince us and to convince many of our friends that naming Schar for Jimmy and Rosalind Carter would be an appropriate and a wonderful and a fitting name for what we are about, both on the diplomatic end, the Camp David Accords of the world, on the incredible courage in repatriating the Panama Canal, which was in many ways the major act of decolonization of the 20th century.
So let me give you one anecdote that I think is very important. Carter really lost the support of the base of the Democratic Party. Organized labor abandoned him for Kennedy after we raised the minimum wage and championed labor law reform. Women's groups, he appointed record numbers of women. We extended the time for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment by 3 years. And some of the more liberal women's groups abandoned him. The Jewish community, he got the lowest percentage of Jewish votes of any Democratic candidate or president in modern times. 40% after we got 70% in 1976. After bringing the first peace between Israel and its most powerful Arab neighbor, after breaking the back of the Arab boycott, after championing Soviet and Iranian Jewry, saved 50,000 Iranian Jews and Christians from Khomeini, after being the father of the Holocaust Museum, the whole liberal wing deserted him. So here we are. We go into the general election. We are slaughtered. We win 6 states in the District of Columbia. 6 states in the District of Columbia. So here it is, December of '76. Carter says to us, we only have 2.5 months left in office during the transition. We're going to make it the best transition out ever. The hostage agreement was reached, the Superfund chemical cleanup, the Alaska Lands Bill, and something that's very important today and again underscores the bipartisanship that existed there. So Ted Kennedy calls me up and he said, Stu, there's a vacancy on the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston. I'd like the president to appoint my aide, Harvard Law School professor with whom you worked on airline deregulation, a fellow named Stephen Breyer. Ever heard of him? And I said, Senator, there are 2 insurmountable hurdles to doing this. He said, what are those? I said, the first is there's no love lost by Carter toward you. He thinks you split the party and never reconciled. He said, I know, that's why I'm calling you, not the president. He says, what's the second insurmountable hurdle? I said, well, we lost the Senate in 1980 as well. Strom Thurmond's going to be the new chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Why would he want to appoint a Democrat to a lifetime position on the Court of Appeals when he can wait for Reagan to come in and appoint a conservative Republican? Ted says, you take care of Carter, I'll take care of Strom. So I go in with some trepidation to see the president. I have my legal pad, and I have like 10 reasons, and I start by saying, forget who's asked for this. There's a vacancy on the court. You know Steve Breyer, he would be a tribute to your administration to appoint him, and of course he knew what was happening. He said, you're right, Steve was critical, he'd be a great judge, I'll do it. Call Ted, it's done, how about your end of the deal? Strom's in the bag. I said, what do you mean Strom's in the bag? You guys are at polar opposites of the political spectrum. He said, well, Steve has, as my counsel, has breakfast every morning with Emory Sneeden, Thurman's chief of staff. They work together. They work in a bipartisan way on a lot of things. Thurman likes them. And in a lame duck session with Reagan about to take office, unanimously the Senate votes for Stephen Breyer for the First Circuit, and he will tell you to this day he would never be on the Supreme Court if that had not happened. Again, it's a bipartisanship that is so lacking today and that it was important at that time.
I do want to leave time for questions and answers from the audience. Let me just say, perhaps mainly to the students here, that the other indispensable book to read about the post-presidency years up to 2002, when President Carter is awarded the Nobel Prize, is by the eminent historian Douglas Brinkley. And that is another wonderful book. And if you want to get the second part of that story, which to us really cements the notion of the appropriateness of naming the school after Jimmy and Rosalind, read Douglas Brinkley's book also.
I may say, if I may be commercial for a minute, you'll see in the inside cover, Brinkley says this was an epic biography of.
Yes. That's because Doug's book is quite a bit shorter than yours still. Let me, Maria, perhaps, oh, right there, okay. So there's a mic there, and please come up if you want to ask a question. Steve Cumby.
Steve, by the way, is a very dear friend, and Steve really made the connection, which I enormously appreciate, with George Mason. So Steve, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for being here, Stu. And I had heard a shorter version of this earlier, but it was terrific, and I learned a lot. And I haven't finished the book yet, but you've given me a lot of reasons to do that. I guess what I wanted to ask was that Carter was certainly criticized for being very detail-oriented, and you alluded to it in some of your remarks. And I guess my question was, and I've always wondered about this, did that prevent him from having the vision and the strategic view that I think a president needs?
Yeah, Steve, it's a very good point, and I want to say that it did not. He had, for example, the vision that our energy situation could not continue as we grew day by day more dependent on OPEC. He had the vision that the Middle East was going to blow up if he didn't bring peace. He had the vision that we were already getting guerrilla fights in the Panama Canal, that this would get worse. So I don't think he did. But here's what I do think. I think that it's a presidency in which the total, and I've enumerated many of the achievements, was less than the sum of its parts. Now, why do I say that? Partly because, as I mentioned, Iran, inflation, the Kennedy challenge sort of obscured the achievements, but also because, and here I don't think it was that he was a detailed man, it was the inability to articulate an overall vision and message that fit together all these initiatives. When he saw a problem, he wanted to attack it, and he did, but it didn't come in the context of an overall umbrella that people could understand. Reagan had a very simple, message. Trump has a very simple message, and so forth. So I think that was lost. Now, I would say, if you look at some of the Democratic presidents, Clinton, Obama, they also didn't have a sort of one-sentence response. So, in part, I think because we have so many interests in the party pulling, it's difficult to do it. But he didn't have the kind of messaging that either Obama or Clinton did. And he was not a schmoozer with respect to politics. I mean, I'll give you one wonderful anecdote that I have in a book. So Carter's presidency is starting to sink in '79. He goes to Camp David for a retreat, has the sort of best and the brightest to advise him on how to write his separate state. That's what led to the so-called Malaise speech, was an incredible speech. We almost lost Mondale over that. But the interesting thing is, one of the people that's invited to give him advice is a young 32-year-old first-term governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton. And so what is Clinton's advice? He says, Mr. President, you're always preaching sacrifice. Be happy. Love politics. Talk about the future in positive terms. He was able to do that in ways that Carter wasn't. There was sort of a Jeremiah quality to Carter.
Yes. Solon Simmons.
Well, thank you so much for the talk. I'm Solon Simmons, professor here. And in the spirit of your insider point of view of the kind of things that were going on and who made decisions and why, there's a story out there, and I don't know how credible the story is, about Brzezinski and the Mujahideen in particular. And the idea that if we had been humiliated in Vietnam, perhaps the Soviets could be humiliated also in Afghanistan. And I wonder if there's any truth to that idea that Brzezinski knew what might happen there, and how you reflect on that legacy.
Yes, so one of the things that was quite provocative at the Khyber Pass in Pakistan is big, as you're looking over into the Soviet Union from Pakistan, before the invasion, grabs one of the rifles from the Pakistani soldiers, holds it up, and says, let's shoot some bear, like the Russian bear. Zbig was Polish-born. He remembered how the Soviet Union had dismembered his country. And that was very much a part of his thought process. Now, there was unanimity on arming the so-called Mujahideen, the opposition to the Soviet puppets. Zbig was certainly a leading advocate for that. But Zbig was a leading advocate for a muscular approach to everything, including the hostage crisis, the Soviet Union in general. So this was very much part of his background. And that's why I said to Carter during the CIA briefing, during the break, I said, Zbig is great and Vance is terrific, but they have totally polar opposite views on how to deal with the Soviet Union. I mean, Tsai wanted everything to be diplomatic, and Zbig wanted confrontation. There was a big issue of so-called linkage. So Zbig's view was everything the Soviets did should be linked. If they want SALT II, nuclear arms negotiations, then they need to stop supporting Cuban proxies in Africa. And Tsai's view was, no linkage. If SALT II is in our national interest to reduce arms, then even though they're misbehaving in Africa, we should do that and, not worry about, not worry, but not let it stop our negotiations. And this was a running battle for over 3 years. Tsai opposed the rescue effort in a very dramatic fashion in Iran. He had been Secretary of the Army in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He had seen what happened in Vietnam. He was the only insider who opposed the rescue effort. And in a very dramatic meeting where the planners go over the entire rescue effort and how it's going to work, we turn to Tsai and say, now, are you convinced now this can work? And he said, no. He said, I sat through all these briefings during Vietnam. The military will never tell you they can't do something. And he said right there, I'm telling you right now, whether the rescue effort fails or succeeds, and he says, obviously, I hope it succeeds, I'm leaving. I don't believe in it. And he did. I still believe, and it's sort of verified in a way by the interview I did of Tsai, that was for him the straw that broke the camel's back. He just tired of the endless conflict with Zbig.
Yes, Dean Rozelle.
After he left the White House, James Fallows would tell this story publicly that there was a speech that the president was going to give at the Naval Academy outlining his vision for foreign policy. He asked Vance and Brzezinski each to propose a draft of the speech, and that Carter took the two versions, stapled them, and read it verbatim. I've never believed that story.
It is absolutely true, and it's in my book.
It's in your book.
in my
It
book.
actually did happen. Okay.
It did happen.
Wow.
And it showed the bifurcation of thinking. Tsai was saying, we have to extend the olive branch. Zbig was, we have to show our spears. And Carter basically said, we're going to try everything we can to solve these things diplomatically, but we're also willing to take tough action if necessary. He literally stapled the two together. And Bob Hunter, who was on the National Security Council, literally saw the true drafts essentially stapled together.
Wow.
Jim Fallows also talked about the tennis court as an example of micromanagement, that Carter somehow managed the tennis court. Not true. He gave all of us the opportunity, no president before or since did, to go to Camp David and also to play on the tennis court in the South Lawn of the White House. He only said, send in your request to Susan Clow, my secretary, so when I want to play or Rosalind wants to play, we're not out there with you.
Sir.
I'm curious what your impressions were of Reagan and why he was able to be more popular than Carter, and what Carter's relationship with Reagan was like.
So if you don't read anything else, you'll love the Reagan election chapter. First of all, we mistakenly underestimated how good a politician he was. We thought he was a grade B movie actor who was opposed to Medicare, Social Security, who was trigger happy, all of which, by the way, was true. But we underestimated how effective he was as a communicator. And then we get to a seminal decision 8 days before the election. We mistakenly agreed to a debate. Never should an incumbent debate an opponent, particularly one that you're trying to convince the public is a scary figure, 8 days before the election. Reagan wins the election. He's got this aw shucks sort of attitude. He makes a brilliant closing argument, which is, in a sentence, if you think the last 4 years are acceptable economically, you should vote for the president. If you think they're not and you can do better, vote for me. What we didn't know until afterward, and what I verify in my book, including not only a conservative columnist named Craig Shirley, who wrote a book about it, but interviewing Jim Baker is one of my 350 plus interviews, who was Reagan's campaign manager, later became his chief of staff, and then Secretary of the State and Secretary of Treasury in another administration. And Baker says, to my question, is it true that you guys stole our debate book? And he said, it's true. He said, Bill Casey, who was our chairman, comes in 2 weeks before the debate, plops down this big, thick book, which I put together, and said, Jim, I think you might like to see this. And Baker said to me in the interview, he said, Stu, you know, I knew it was stolen. I gave a sort of second's thought, maybe I shouldn't use it, but only a second's thought. And so when we sort of challenged, when Carter challenged Reagan in a debate, you know, with what he had said about Social Security and Medicare, he made the famous statement, there you go again. Well, I mean, he knew our attack lines. I don't say that's the only reason he won the debate, but it sure didn't hurt. So we underestimated him. Now, there were one or two other things really important to Reagan's success. The hostage crisis was one. And here I cannot prove it, and I don't try to overstate it. But our NSC advisor, Gary Sick, who Hal knew, who was the Iran guy on the National Security Council staff, wrote a book in which, and Gary's a very level, he's a professor at Columbia, a very level-headed guy, that not only did they steal our debate book, but they went to Khomeini during the campaign and said, don't release the hostages. That will elect Carter. There were congressional hearings on this. It was never fully verified, but what we do know is a fellow named George H.W. Bush, who was the vice presidential candidate, later president, was in Paris days before the election. I mean, it's nice to go to the Champs-Élysées. You'd think maybe he would want to campaign. We know that Bill Casey, the campaign manager, went to Mexico. We can't be certain, and again, I'm not alleging it, but there were certainly allegations that this occurred. The other thing, though, that was really vital, and here Reagan deserves credit, and it's true Republican orthodoxy to this day, is the Republican Party had been noted up to this point for budget austerity, cutting budgets, balanced budgets. Suddenly, an economist nobody had ever heard of named Laffer comes up with the so-called Laffer Curve, which mainstream economists derived to this day, which was if you cut taxes enough, you get enough revenue back to make up for the lost revenue from the tax cuts. Kemp-Roth tax bill was introduced in 1980. Reagan endorses that, and now they become the sort of go-go party. You know, no more austerity. We're going to have it all. Low budget deficits and tax cuts. Reagan had triple-digit deficits. Trump's tax cuts are going to cause even more, trillions of dollars of debt. But that was an important component at a time we had high inflation and slow growth. He was a terrific politician.
Thank you. We'll take one more. Joe Montville, retired Foreign Service officer.
I was in the Near East Bureau and I worked for Hal Saunders as Assistant Secretary. I was Chief of the Near East Division and Bureau of Intelligence and Research. later director of the Office of Global Issues. I can tell you one thing about Bill Casey. There was nothing he wouldn't do to win whatever he wanted to do.
He had been head of the OSS, by the way.
Yeah,
In fact, may I just tell you one thing? I'm sorry.
Sure.
This is a great story. So Casey had been head of the predecessor agency of the CIA during World War II. He'd headed a major part of OSS. So Baker says to me during the interview, and this is a guy who's, consummate politician, became a great Secretary of State, etc. And he said, for once in my life, I was really afraid when I was asked to testify in Congress about these stolen debate books. And I said, well, why are you afraid? Because he said, I was going to tell the truth, that they were stolen. Bill Casey denied that they were stolen when he put it on my desk. And I knew that having been head of the OSS, he knew how to defeat a lie detector. So anyway.
well, we had, we came to a conclusion in Intelligence and Research in the State Department that Casey's style as director of CIA was to come to the conclusions of a national defense or national security estimate, and then give it to us to fill in the data to prove his conclusions. He was a very, very tough SOB. I just want to commend your book. I am one of the, I'm not going to ask who else has read it to almost 1,000 pages, but it's a brilliant piece of work of incredible accuracy of what life was like inside the White House. And I don't know if there's ever been a senior staffer in the White House that took so many notes, did 500 or 5,000 yellow pads to really emphasize the importance of ethics and commitment and public service of a young, an engineer and a peanut farmer who didn't know how to handle Washington, but he never surrendered on his values. So I commend you for this and thank you for it. And I'm determined in my association with Schar to raise the 7 million plus change to make the deal and get Jimmy and Rosalind Carter's name on our school.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Stu. We have copies of the book outside. I'm sure that Stu will be happy to inscribe it. We also have a reception next door. So I want to thank you all for coming, and Stu for this remarkable inside look into what it was like to make the sausage that is politics. I won't even say what's being made.
Bismarck said, you don't want to see two things. You don't want to see sausage made or laws made. You'll see the laws made here and understand why he said that.